When I'm working on an applique project, my favorite way to finish my appliques are with the blanket stitch. And I'm going to show you how simple it is. So come along. Hi friends, I'm Barbara-Sue from Kowalski Mountain, and we are here in the waterfall garden today. Now, if you've watched my quilting series of making baby hunters quilt, I did a medallion quilt with applique in the middle. And I finished all of my appliques with the blanket stitch. Now, when I made that video, I started with the deer because it was the showcase of the quilt. But it was really hard to see how to do a blanket stitch. So today we're going to go over that again so you know how to do it on your own. Now I have a simple applique here that I prepared, and I prepared it in light colors so that we can see it really nicely. Now some of the tools that you're going to need to do a blanket stitch is an embroidery stitch, and it's easiest to do it when you have a hoop. Now an embroidery hoop comes in all different sizes. This kind are relatively cheap. There's actually a sticker on this. This was $1. So these are really cheap and affordable for anyone. And it really helps because it keeps your project nice and tight so that you can do your stitches. Now a couple other things you need. You need scissors. You need a thimble. Now, if you've never sewed with a thimble before, you might find it uncomfortable and a little awkward. Now you'll really get used to it. Now you notice it's on my middle finger, and that's because when I'm stitching, I'm going to be holding my needle with my forefinger and my thumb. And I'm going to use my middle finger with my thimble to push it through when it's difficult to push through. Now you also might like a needle grabber. Now this is certainly an optional piece of equipment, but this is a little piece of rubber, and this makes a really big difference when you are trying to pull a needle through multiple layers of fabric, especially in the case where we've used the heat and bond. This is a little thick, and like on the face of the deer that I did, there were 4 layers of heat and bond and fabric, and it can be really hard to pull your needle through, so a needle grabber helps in those cases. Now the other thing that I have is a needle threader. Now that's certainly not required, but as I'm getting older, this is more needed. So I brought it to show you. Now when you're choosing an embroidery needle, or a sewing needle, like when I quilted, hand quilted, a number 10 needle is considered the best because you can make very tiny stitches, and that's preferred in hand quilting. With an embroidery needle, you need a little bit bigger of a needle because you need it to be able to handle the embroidery floss. But use the smallest one that you can because it is going to help you make smaller stitches. Now we're also going to use embroidery floss, and I invaded my mother-in-law's stash again to get some, and I kind of tangled this up a little bit. Here we go. Now I've been doing embroidery and quilting for quite a long time, and I tend to try to use a longer piece of thread so that I don't have to rethread it as frequently. This is a big old mess. But a shorter thread is going to be most beneficial. You're going to be able to handle it better. So even if you have to thread your needle more times, it's preferred to use a shorter length of thread. Now when you're working with embroidery floss has 6 threads in it. And depending on your project, might depend how many threads you want to use. Now I'm just going to split this into 2 threads with 3 threads each. So I've just split them, and I'm running my finger through and separating that. And this is twisting, so you want to untwist it and just keep on going through. Now you can do as many threads as you want. Sometimes I only use 2. Sometimes I use 3. Sometimes I use 6, which would be the entire piece. Depends on what I'm sewing and how predominantly I want my stitches to stand out. Now we're going to use our needle threader because I didn't bring my glasses. That wasn't very smart. So my needle is on my needle threader. And I'm just going to slip that through. Now every time I lick the thread like that, I always think of my mother, because she'll tell you that you should not lick your threads, because what actually happens when you lick your threads, because people usually lick it to thread their needle, but what actually happens is that the thread absorbs your saliva and it expands. So licking your threads is actually not beneficial, though everybody does it. Now I have a simple knot on the end of my thread that's going to catch it on the back of the fabric. Now that knot's a little bit messy, so we can trim it up a little bit, because with a light colored background like what we have, you can actually see that knot right through it. Now, on the blog, I put complete written instructions with a diagram to show you how to place your needle. So I'm going to go over all the steps, but that printable resource is available at KowalskiMountain.com. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up from the back on the edge of my quilt. This is going to be our starting point. Right, and we're right on the edge of the applique. And we're going to pull this through, all the way through. And you can see that the knot caught it on the back. Now you're going to do what's called a stitch length, and you create the stitch length. It can be a 1/4 inch, it can be 1/8 of an inch, it can be 1/2 inch. Whatever your stitch length is your preference, but the key to it is to remain consistent and try to make even stitches. I'm going to make my stitch length. So I'm going to come over about 1/4 inch and down about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to go through my applique. So my needle's just barely through. And I'm going to tip it up, and I'm going to come up on the very edge of my applique. And I'm going to push that needle through. Now I'm going to take the tail of my thread and I'm going to wrap it around, because a blanket stitch is going to have a piece that goes all the way around, and you can see how that has caught that stitch. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go about 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch down, and I pierced my needle through. I'm rocking up, and I want to come up right on the edge of my applique. That wasn't quite right. There it is. It's right on the edge of my applique. Wrap the thread around it, and you can pull it through. And you can see how our stitches are starting to leave that edge along it. Now we're going to go over about 1/4 and down 1/4, pierce the fabric, rock the needle up, and come out right at the edge of the applique. We wrap that thread around it, and we pull it through. And if your threads are not laying quite the way you want them, you can kind of adjust them with your needle tip. Now we just keep doing this, so over, down. And we wrap. And we pull it through. And you can see our stitches here coming along. Now we're just going to keep doing that. Well, some of those weren't very straight. That one wasn't very straight. Now some people who do blanket stitches, they vary the length of their stitches. So they can make like one long stitch and then 2 short ones and then another long one. So you can make this as decorative as you want. I tend to make it very simple, just straight stitches, and try to keep them as even as possible. Now I'll be honest, I'm struggling with the camera a little bit to give you a really good view and working around it, so some of my stitches aren't as pretty as I'd like. Now right here on this corner, I'm going to just do a very simple, I've got my end, I'm going to go ahead and stitch through the fabric because I want to lock that stitch in place. So that's locked so that this little thread right here is not going to move, and that's what we don't want it to move. We want it to stay nice and straight where it needs to be. And then we're going to just come right back up, and we're going to continue our stitch. Ouch! I just poked myself with the needle. Now I'll be honest, my stitches do not look as amazing as I would like them to look for you, but I'm kind of struggling working around the camera so that you can see. I'm trying to look through the lens and do this for you. I felt like the stitching on Hunter's quilt came out much better. And one thing with blanket stitch, curves are harder. So making a curve is going to be a little bit harder than a straight edge, which you're going to see when we get down to the straight edge. Now you'll notice that my needle's getting a little twisted, so I'm just going to straighten out that thread before we continue. So it's about a quarter inch down. Rocking my needle up so that it comes out right on the edge of the applique, and it comes through. Now right here, these stitches are wanting to turn in a little bit. That's because we're on the curve. So let me show you what I'm going to do about that. I'm going to go through to the back, and I'm going to come up right here, and I come out right outside, and I'm going to grab a hold of that little thread, and I'm going to pull it over because it's wanting to shift because of that inner curve, and I do not want it to shift. So I'm going to tie it down a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing right here. I'm going to go right through those little stitches, and I'm going to pull them over so they stay where I want them to. Now on Hunter's quilt, I did this on the Sunshine. The Sunshine had some areas of struggle because of the points on it, and I had to tack those down as well. Oh, not right here. Stop. There. Those look a little bit better. Roxy, stop. There. They're a little bit better than they were. And I'm just going to go back and keep on going. You can see how those stitches on the straight edge, they are looking nicer, a little bit straighter. Curves are more difficult. If you're new to doing a blanket stitch, just be aware that your curves are going to be a little bit more challenging. Now we're about out of thread, so let's go ahead and stop right here. So I'm just going to go through to the back, and I'm going to just slip under this, and we're going to knot this. And I kind of use my fingernail to tighten that up. So we've tied our knot. And we're just going to clip that. Now some people just tie to the previous thread and continue, but I don't personally like that method. Now we're going to use the needle threader again. So I'm just going to put my needle threader through my needle. It's just kind of hanging on there. And I have my other thread that's already prepared. We're going to pull that through, and we're going to tie a little knot back here. So we're here to the point. So I'm going to come up here at the very tip of my heart, and I'm going to wrap around it just like we've been doing. And this is one of those places that we want to set that stitch. That was too tight, so let's loosen it. We want to set that stitch. So I am going to go through, and I'm going to set that because I want that point to stay nice and sharp. And then I'm going to come back up, and I'm going to continue my blanket stitch. Now the really nice thing, about hand sewing is you can do it anywhere. You can do it at home, in the house. You can do it on your lunch break. You can do it in the park. Or you can do it out here in your favorite spot on your property. Now I know the waterfall garden doesn't look like all that yet, but I have hopes for it to be like a real respite of a place to come with a bench and flowers and just a really nice little place to hang out. Now I hope to make Philip and I a quilt. And I imagine I'm going to do a lot of stitching out here. Now with my stitching, I'm looking at it, and because I'm demoing this for you, I obviously want to do a good job so that you understand the concept, which I hope I've demonstrated it well. But just like anyone else, my stitches are sometimes wonderful and sometimes not. And some of these are not very even, and like I said, I'm struggling with the camera. But that's the thing about handmade things, is that they're unique. And every stitch is unique. And some are perfect and some aren't. And you know what? That's really okay. Now we're almost to the end, so let me show you that. So as I get close to the end here, I want to try to make my stitches even. So I really only have enough for one more stitch in between here to make that look even. I'm going to wrap up, wrap around. Now this one we're going to do just the same. And we're going to come up right here And we're going to go right back through the end, right there. And those should have been spaced a little bit better, but that is the end. Now we're going to tie off on the back just like we did before. So I like to just go under a single thread, tie a knot, and I tighten it with my fingernail. And there she is. Well, friends, I hope that helps you understand the blanket stitch a little bit better. Now be sure to go to the blog post, KowalskiMountain.com, to see the full written instructions, and it's also a printable card that you can print out with the full instructions and a diagram to show you how to do your needle placement to get you started. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series of quilt making for Baby Hunter's Quilt and this supplemental video all about how to do the blanket stitch. Friends, we so much appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye. And we'll see you next time.